I'm gonna have to read more about this. Well, comrades, you know what time it is. Time to roll that intro. Now, this time, as you noticed, I get us some new animated emotes. So whenever we get the viewer emotes, I'll move the Trailer Park Boys ones to that. But yeah, I just still want to see more than just one scientist do about it. The bots have been purged. Well, yay. Falcon, totally agree. Welcome, comrades. Sleeping Larry here. Of course, you know you can just call me Larry. You can call me Leaping if you want, but I prefer Comrade. And how are all my comrades watching right now today? I see some chatters in here. Welcome, live viewers. Welcome, people in the future who's watching this later. Hope you're well there in the future. How's it going, comrades in chat? Falcon? 2023 Bup Commander has a new bookshelf. Welcome in, everyone. Hope you all are well today. We're going to start our streams like we always do, but before I do that, I just want to make a mention that I'm sure you notice I'm streaming a little bit later today than normal. So my plan is this. I want to try and figure out where I'm best going to fit for streaming. So I'm going to stream today. What is today? Thursday. I'm going to stream every Thursday now, starting at 7. And every Friday, I'm going to be starting at 10. And then Monday, Tuesday will be 9 in the morning. And then Wednesday will be by noontime. And then if one of them like has significantly more viewers over some amount of time or something, then maybe I'll stick with that time. Or I'll just keep it up as I'm going. Depends on how it works out. Basically, we're trying to find our little slot to fit into. Well, without further ado, why don't we get to our next Squirrel and Hedgehog cartoon, comrades? Get cozy. When we're done with that, of course, I have a few other things I want to watch here. I've got a couple good music parts here. Remember, we listen to Morang Bong Band. And then just a couple short selections, and then we will be getting to our read of Red Skin, White Masks.
안녕하십니까. 금세기를 없애려던 에코 특무대장놈이 계획을 파탄시키고 그를 무사히 떠나보낸 두더지 보현대장 줄다라미는 얼마나 기쁜지 몰랐답니다. 그런데 바로 그 시각 그들은 악독한 원수놈들이 자기들을 노리며 피를 물고 날뛰고 있다는 것을 그만 잊고 있었습니다. 그럼 이제부터 그 이야기를 들어보십시오. 줄다라마, 이리 와. 내가 이 약줄 발라줄게.
응? 큰 싸움을 끝냈는데 이쯤한 걸 가지고 뭘? 금세기가 박지섬에 무사히 갔을까?
가지 않고 금세기가 누구라고?
넌 이젠 꽃동산으로 떠나야 할 텐데 눈을 좀 붙이렴.
금세기가 이 장풍숲을 꼭 수색해보라고 하지 않았니?
일 없어. 그래야 덕수리 패단경 미운 놈 있겠는데 뭐. 그것들이 무슨 맥을 쓰겠니?
아니야. 우리가 쉬는 짬에도 원수놈들이 우리 꽃동산을 먹기 위해 불을 갈고 있다.
Don't call the FBI.
대장동무가 늘 말하지 않았니? 응?
It's what are you talking about? It's just a generic sailor suit. It doesn't look like any other duck anyone's ever seen before. Not at all. No resemblance whatsoever. Exactly. Way sexier duck than Donald.
참 무얼이야. 며칠 밤을 뜬 눈으로 세우더니 무얼이는 이제 꽃동산으로 돌아가서 그리운 동무들을 만나겠구나. 꽃동산에 그리운 동무들아. 아직 시간이 있으니까 좀 더 재워야지.
꽃동산을 타고 앉을 준비가 이제는 끝나가고 있다. 박지섬으로 간 특별 보좌관한테서는 소식이 없는가?
예, 장풍숲에서 갑자기 덕수리를
Yeah, Donald Duck's voice and look always makes me think he's just catcalling everyone. I can see why.
장놈의 작가니.
에꾸. 날랜 놈으로 도면 골라서 내 방으로 보내라.
명령대로 왔습니다.
장풍숲에서 소동이 일어난 걸 봐선 거기가 심상치 않다. 그곳에 몰래 들어가 어떤 놈들이 어슬렁거리고 있는지 알아보고 무조르르 알리라.
알았습니다.
에꾸 그놈이 아직 살아있겠는가?
야, 뭐라고 있어? 아직도 생각 중이야. 뭐, 자살하겠다고 총을 빼든 지 1시간이 지났는데 아직도 그 모양이야.
꽃동산.
Right? What the fuck?
아니다. 난
Just see photos of drones displayed at DPRK Expo on the anniversary 70 years since.
드디어 가시고.
Oh, damn. Oh, shit. Welcome in, comrades. Thank you for raiding there, Skade Fran. Jeez. Welcome in, welcome in. Thank you so much for the raid. How was the stream, Skade Fran? Hope you all are well today. We're just watching some Squirrel and Hedgehog, which is a cartoon from the DPRK, if you don't know. And yeah, then we're gonna read some of this work right here. If you don't know me, I'm a communist streamer. You can call me Leaping Larry. You can call me Larry. You can just call me Comrade. If you follow me long enough on YouTube, like right here, you might know me as Juche Gang. Maybe you've been following this channel. I'm also Juche Gang on Twitter as well. I do a lot of watching communist movies. You need to go to bed? Well, that's totally understandable. Thanks again for the raid. Have a good night, Skade. On this channel, we watch, you know, communist agitprop. Right now, again, we're watching Squirrel and Hedgehog. We got some other short selections coming up here before I'm going to do my reading, which will be a reading of Red Skin, White Mask, Lin Sean Coulthard. Extremely good one. So I want to share with everyone. This is going to take several streams. We do this Tuesday and Thursdays. The cartoon did get a little dark, but there's a warning when you come into the channel, to be fair. But yeah, it is a little dark. There was mention of suicide just a second ago in this show. Now, I don't know what age it's aimed at, but you know. It is what it is. It's in the cartoon. We got lots of cool sound bites in here, by the way. Feel free to spend your labor vouchers on those sound bites. And yeah, I'm a still picture down here in the bottom left for now. One day I will get that webcam. Also, if you're unfamiliar with my works, as I always say, a lot of my time, or portion of my internet time, I should say, goes towards helping comrades over at Iskra Books, which I highly recommend as a resource. We offer free PDFs of all the works that we publish here. So go on, check it out. Get yourself a little bit more revolutionary thinking. How's all the raiders today? I'm not sure what Juche is. I'm not sure if it's or a similar word to Juche. I don't know what Juche is. What does that mean? Does that mean something? Hey, observable goal, sip. Matt. Well, buckle up, comrades. We're gonna finish this cartoon. By the way, if anyone has 420 labor vouchers, your favorite Juche studying communist here could use a toke. You know what? If you catch my drift. There we go. Thank you, Frank.
꽃동산에 간 물망초 자식은 어떻게 된 거야? 왜 소식이 없어?
I would have been friends with Stalin.
장풍 숲에 다 왔구나.
Oh my god.
어디?
내일은 왜 이렇게 꼬이기만 하는가? 대장님은 날 잡기만 하면 죽여버리겠다고 우고 가지. 특별 보좌관인지 둘째 새끼인지 그놈한테는 계속 골탕만 먹고. 게다가 독수리 부대는 다 녹아나고 몇 놈 안 남았는데 아이고 어떻게 한다.
총무대장님, 진정하십시오.
뭐야? 이놈들이 감히 누구한테 분신질이야? 썩나가 이 생기 새끼들아!
We have a couple new emotes here.
당신 같은 놈? 어디 와서 뺨 맞고 우리한테 행악질이야? 야,
You can now press F for respect.
저거 물망초 어디? 임마, 저걸 보란 말이야. 물망초가 꽃동산에서 돌아오면 연기를 싫어하겠다고 하지 않았어? 야, 물망초다. 먹을 걸 좀 가지고 가야지. 물망초 형님, 꿈속에서까지 그려봤으나 형님.
자식, 내스겁게 놀지 마라.
That's a big F. True story.
가만, 물오리가 잠든 사이 연대에 내려가서 꽃동산에 보낼 기념품을 가져와야지. 물오리를 혼자 두고 가도 일 없을까? 에이, 잠깐이면 될 텐데 뭐.
줄다람이는 어디 갔을까? 무슨 용기일까? 이상한데?
아이고 다리야, 좀 쉬었다 가자.
참 생각 잘했어.
That's a pretty good one.
대장이 잔뜩 열이 올라 있는데 좀 늦게 돌아가는 게 좋지요.
뭐? 잔뜩 올랐다고? 왜?
글쎄, 특별보좌관한테 혼쭐이 나고선 갑자기 정신이 나갔는지 곤충을 뽑아들고 땅땅.
뭐? 내가 가져온 비밀 자료를 보면 부모대장도 달라질 게다. 비밀 자료? 줄다람이가 있어야 할 텐데. 꽃동산에서 가져온 이 자료를 보면 눈이 뒤집힐 게다.
꼼짝마라! 까마귀 순찰병이다. 내 놈들은 누구야? 그 가방 안에 들어있는 게 뭔가?
물오리? 저놈은 분명 꽃동산의 정찰병이다.
이리 가져와, 빨리!
Yeah, Communist Party of Kenya does good stuff.
줄은? 물거리면 쏴 죽일 테다!
예.
꼼짝 마라! 움직이면 쏜다!
줄다람이가 멀리 가진 않았을 테니 총소리를 내야 한다. 어떤 놈들일까? 혹시 물오리가?
야! 야! 이놈아!
저라! 난 꽃동산 내 놈들을 보기만 해도 이가 갈리고 피가 거꾸로 솟는다. 난 내 놈의 두 누나를 뽑아내고 그 다음엔 혀를 잘라 피를 말려 죽일 테다.
아, 형님! 어서 저놈의 피를 좀 봅시다고요! 어서요! 네.
아니다. 지금은 부모대장한테 끌고 가야 해. 일이 이렇게 된 바엔 차라리 기회를 봐서 비밀 문건이든 저 가방을 떼사내야 한다. 줄다람이 왜 나타나지 않을까?
그래.
총소리가 분명 이 근방에서 나는데 물오리야. 물오리가 어디 갔을까? 아니. 어떤 놈들이 물오리를? 이게 웬일이야? 물오리야. 물오리가 깃들로 위치를 알려주었구나. 보련들, 나 윤대장이다. 장풍숲에 수상한 놈들이 있다. 윤대 비상!
His helmet's like rotating around his head.
바지도 안 입었어? 바지. 성무대장님, 꽃동산에 갔던 물망초 돌아왔습니다.
물망쳐야 돌아왔구나.
성무대장님!
갔던 일은?
네, 망원들은 체포됐지만 독가시는 살아서 귀중한 비밀 자료들을 보내왔습니다.
그래? 어디 보자.
예. 예이씨!
독가시가 독을 쓰기 시작했구나.
예,
좋아.
성무대장님, 저길 좀 보십시오. 꽃동산에 종찰병을 잡아왔습니다.
아니 이거 물오리 정찰병이 아닌가? 물망쳐야 내가 날 살려주는구나. 이 자료와 저 물오리면 우리 대장님이 신임을 받고도 남음이 있다.
직승기, 나한테 오라. 좌표 유라나 이거, 좌표 유라나 이거. 전개 투하.
유대장님, 덕수리굴 앞에서 물오리 개토를 발견했습니다.
좋다. 수리구를 보여라.
유대장님, 회의를 끝냈습니다.
수색을 시작하라. 야, 인파라. 물오리를 구원해야 한다.
지금 쪽제비 대장이 본부로 돌아갔다는데 거기로 찾아가자.
저놈들이 대장놈에게 비밀 자료를 넘겨주려고 하는구나. 이걸 막아야 할 텐데.
승무대장님, 지금 두더지포 연대가 막 쳐들어오고 있습니다.
뭐야? 야 빨리 도망치자.
아니, 제 벽길인데 도망은 왜?
아니다. 저것들은 무지막지한 놈들이야. 무작정 싸걸린단 말이야. 자, 이 비상구로 빨리.
저 이놈을 처리해버릴까요?
임마, 너 같은 놈 100놈이라도 저놈의 몸값에 대비 안 돼. 끌고 가자.
야, 장병 주새끼들이 어디 있어?
저기
발성을 가라.
어.
한 발을 놓쳤구나. 이놈들이 어디로 갔을까? 꽃동산 비밀 자료를 물망초가 쪽집이 대장한테로? 물오리야. 야, 시도! 놈들은 분명 땅속 비상물로 해서 강을 건너려 할 것이다. 그런데 땅굴은 강물을 뚫지 못한 것만큼 반드시 이 온천강 기술에 나타날 것이다. 천강물 봉사라!
이래래. 승무대장님, 물입니다.
이제부터는 은천강이다. 이 강을 따라가면 대장님을 만나게 된다. 자, 시간이 없다.
빨리 가라. 야, 고무배다.
자, 빨리 발동을 걸어라. 빨리
Hey,
속도를
junk.
높여라, 속도를.
It's the perfect emote for the channel in general.
돌아서면 죽는다. 전진하라, 전진하라.
여기서 벌어지는 일들이 심상치 않구나.
빨리 대장님께 무전을 합시다.
자, 집중이 하나. 놈들을 찾았다. 사격을 승인해달라. 역하지 말고 생포하라. 역사격만 승인한다.
발동기가 고장입니다.
아니,
야, 올려샷 줘. 내 놈은 여길 빠져나가서 대장님한테 이걸 전해라. 그러면 대장님이 우리를 구원해 줄 게다. 알겠어?
예, 전하겠습니다.
저 비밀 자료 넘겨줘선 안 된다. 승기, 끈병들을 떨구라. 끈병들을 떨구라.
빨리.
나를 해보겠다. 저놈을 놓쳐선 안 된다. 꽃동산아, 잘 있거라. 윤 대장님, 에그와 다른 두 놈을 생포했습니다.
나머지 놈들은
물속으로 도망치게 싹알겠습니다.
뭐야? 누가 내 명령을 거역했어? 나? 네 놈이야? 너?
Oh. Oh shit.
날 죽이지 마.
죽어야 한다. 우리 복수를 위하여.
죽이지 말라! 죽이지 말라! 독재비 대장님의 명령이다!
에이,
어른들을 먹다 우리한테 넘기라! 은 대장도 함께 오라는 대장님의 공부시다!
무료리야.
줄다가마, 우리가 신음잠에도 원수들이 우릴 먹겠다고 이를 갈고 있다는 걸 한시도 잊지 말아야 한다고 대장동무가 늘 말하지 않든.
내가 그들의 말을 귀담아 듣지 않아 얼마나 큰일을 저질렀단 말인가.
연대장, 연대를 인계하고 오늘부터 특수임무를 수행해야겠다.
예? 특수임무요?
그래, 솜씨를 보이라고.
Well then, that's episode 14 for you. Or end it right in the middle of that little jingle. That was an interesting journey. Curious how long it is before we get to some of the newer style animation. I'm betting it's not too long. Right, how about we go for some music now? We got Morang Bong Band.
We're all after something.
Yeah, they tend to get a little bit wild, Buff. That's true. That was a solo and a half. Interlude, whatever the fuck you want to call it. Bridge. Yeah, more of an interlude, I guess. Bunch of instruments were going. Oh yeah, of course. That was a banger, was it not? Sure, I'll link this too. Just get this link for you comrades here. Anarchist Library Sean, welcome comrade. How are you tonight? Cool, Sean. Thanks for coming on in. What? Pin. Oh wait, I should say for watching. There we go. Plenary meeting following items on the agenda on launching a bolder struggle for implementing major policies, epoch-making measures for developing education, decisively enhancing the role of officials of people's committees, and on the issues arising and strengthening the people's power, on the important measures for intensifying the building of party discipline and organizational matter. Greater efforts to bolstering up their capabilities for self-defense and conformity with the present changed security situation. Which, by the way, you can see reflected, the US pulls up with that submarine and the DPRK immediately launches two short-range missiles. Like they were saying, bet you didn't know we have these. Plenary meeting held panel study consultative meetings and draw up positive and detailed measures We're thoroughly implementing the task for the second half of the year, put together and examine the issues that were raised in the discussion. Yes, have a good showering indeed. Deliberating documents to be discussed. Korean people call July 4th, 2017 the delayed July 4th Revolution. Yeah, of course they made it July 4th, just like an extra F you to Americans. '70th anniversary of the great victory in the Fatherland Liberation War. U.S. imperialists and Sigmund Rhee. That's his radio address on the outbreak of the war. Here's university students volunteering for the army after the radio address. Liberation of Seoul, 3 days after the start of the war. Okay, Pop. Of course, self-care is the most important thing first. Enjoy your relaxation, comrade. Thank you for coming by. Yeah, that is true, powerful. The South was very unpopular. It was made up of, I mean, former Japanese collaborators and stuff, right? Now we're into the Korea Today section. Children's unions. This is a meeting of a bunch of the different children's unions. Wheat and barley. The channel that we're watching is from a Korean person living in Germany, I believe. So, just a independently done to DPRK support channel, like. Oh, this is like one of the oldest Buddhist temples here. Holy crap. Printed between 1236 and 1251. Very powerful. Nice seeing some actual color, you know, how it actually looks. There you go, how was that? Got a little talk here from Perenni.
Series of commentaries by Dr. Michael Parenti. Michael Parenti is an activist and internationally
How was that, chat? What did we all think of that magazine? Pretty cool, huh? Okay, I want to copy this for you, comrades. So,
known award-winning author and scholar. His recent books include The Assassination of Julius Caesar and Super Patriotism. His latest book, The Culture Struggle, will be released in November 2005. For further information, please visit his website, michaelparenti.org.
Real democracy. In a democracy, people should be able to enjoy freedom from economic as well as political oppression. In a real democracy, the material conditions of people's lives should be humane and not insufferable. Anatole France once wrote, "The law, in its majestic equality, prohibits rich and poor alike from stealing bread and begging in the streets." And so the law becomes something of a farce, a fiction that allows us to speak of the rights of all, divorced from the class conditions that often place the rich above the law and the poor way below it. In the absence of certain material conditions, formal rights are of little value to millions who lack the means to make a reality of their rights. Take the idea that every citizen has a right to be heard. In its majestic equality, the law allows both the rich and the poor to raise high their political voices. Both are free to hire the best placed lobbyists and Washington lawyers to pressure public office holders. Both are free to shape public opinion by owning a newspaper or television station. And both rich and poor have the right to engage in multi-million-dollar election campaigns to win office for themselves or their political favorite. But again, this formal equality is something of a fiction. Of what good are the rules for those millions who are excluded from the game? We're taught that capitalism and democracy go together. In fact, many capitalist societies, from Nazi Germany to today's third world dictatorships, have private enterprise systems but no political freedom and plenty of mass poverty. We're taught that capitalism and prosperity go together, and yet impoverished countries like capitalist Haiti, capitalist Nigeria, capitalist Indonesia, the mass of people live in terrible poverty. In such systems, economic freedom means the freedom to exploit the labor of the poor and get endlessly rich, and means little more than that. So transnational corporate capitalism is no guarantee of political democracy. When it works with any effectiveness, democracy is dedicated to protecting the well-being of the many and rolling back the economic oppressions and privileges that serve the few. Democracy attributes equal value to all individuals and seeks to ensure that even those who aren't advantaged by wealth or special talent can earn a decent living. The contradictory nature of capitalist democracy is that it professes egalitarian political principles while generating enormous disparities in material well-being and political influence. Some people think that if you're free to say what you like, you're living in a democracy. But freedom of speech is not the sum total of democracy, only one of its necessary conditions. Too often, we're free to say what we want, while those of wealth and power are free to do what they want to us, regardless of what we say. Democracy is not a seminar, but a system of power, like any other form of governance. Freedom of speech, like freedom of assembly and freedom of political organization, is meaningful only if the free speech is heard and if it keeps those in power responsive to those over whom power is exercised. This is Michael Parenti for Radio Truth.
This commentary was produced by the LA Sound Posse and may be freely copied and distributed. You can find us on the web at lasoundposse.org. The music was Flute Medicine by Synth.
I'm the deputy chairman of the state of Illinois Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton. And a lot of people don't understand the Black Panther Party's relationship with white mother country radicals. A lot of people don't even understand that words that they're using.
Here's a great talk.
What we're saying is that there are white people in the mother country that are for the same types of things that we are for stimulating revolution in the mother country. And we said that we'll work with anybody and form coalition with anybody that has revolution on their mind. We're not a racist organization because we understand that racism is an excuse used for capitalism. And we know that racism is a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people. And we're going to have to put it back in the hands of the people. Everybody in the state of Illinois is going to have to be involved or even around the revolution because we're going to have one. We're going to have to do more than talk. We're going to have to do more than listen. We're going to even have to do more than learn. We're going to have to start practicing, and that's very hard. We're going to have to start learning, and you learn through practice. We got to start making mistakes, and you learn through making mistakes. We got to start getting out there with the people. And a lot of times we think we're better than the people, but that's an insult, and that's criminal. Think you're better than the people. We got to get together and learn where it's at. It's going to take a lot of hard work. That breakfast for children is something else. You ought to dig on it. Every sister in this audience. I'm saying every sister in this audience ought to get themselves together and come on down and help us with that Breakfast for Children program. You ought to come down and help feed them children in the morning. We have Breakfast for Children because we teach the people through practice, through observation and participation, that people can be fed free. That's the people thing. Socialism is the people. You're afraid of yourself. If you're afraid of socialism, you're afraid of yourself. We know they have our pictures. We know they're looking for us. We know they want us. But we're still saying that even though we could be in a city,
the revolution that feeds the children gets my support.
Exactly, GMO.
Because of our dedication and understanding what's in the valley, knowing that the people in the valley, knowing that we originally came from the valley, knowing that our flag is the same flag as the people in the valley, knowing that our enemy is on the mountaintop, our friends are in the valley. We say even though it's nice to be on the mountaintop, we're going back to the valley. I be in the office every day. I be in the streets propagandizing every day. I be working with everybody every day. I be teaching that solidarity is the thing. The end of a complete wipeout of imperialism is the thing. So if you're going to be thinking about me, that's what Bobby would be teaching. If you're going to be thinking about us, all we say is ain't no thing about going nowhere, getting killed. All we want to know is that you're doing what we'd be doing if we were here. And you got to do that. You can't do it unless you believe that you can do it. In the spirit of liberation, we understand that they want everybody in the party in jail. And we know that if we try to figure out and separate and divide who should go and who shouldn't go, we spend more time doing that than working for the people. quick solution. The speedy one. Nobody go. Nobody go. We all stay right here. With the people. Because we love the people.
Welcome back, Sean.
Okay, you can put your hands down now. We say all power to all people. We say white power to white people.
Who on that one?
Brown people. Yellow power to yellow people. Black power to black people. X power to those that we left out. We say Panther power to the Vanguard Party. When you leave here saying the last word, before you go to bed tonight, say I am a revolutionary. Make that the last word. In case you don't wake up, then somebody might believe it and you might, end up in what they call a revolutionary happy hunting ground. Say that. I am a revolutionary. Say it when you're going out. Everybody want to listen to me. Okay? We're going to say it while we're going out. Hey, we're going to start a thing called Free Fred. Don't that sound nice? Hey, let's do that. Free Fred. Free Fred. Free Fred. Free Fred. Hey, I ain't even in jail yet.
Okay, we got one more musical number. Right? Hardcore violin playing. That's awesome. Not ridiculously like overblown choreography, you know? Yeah, looks less forced. The whole song looks like, I don't know. It feels like that would be more possible to actually sing and do live instead of just having to, lip sync it or something. That's what it feels like to me, anyway. All right, comrades. So we're going to get to our read here now. We just change the title of this here. Oh, thank you for the 420, comrade. Very much appreciated. Perfect timing. I'll just get the thing posted here. Yep, starting this one today. Wait, that's not going to be the command. This is. All right, there we go. Now we got it. Oh. Perfect way to start. Well, good. I mean, why wouldn't you be? So there's a foreword here by Tayayaki Alfred. Not so very long ago, in Canada, there numbered just less than 14 million inhabitants, 13 million human beings, 500,000 natives. The former had the land, the others had the memory of it. Between the two, there were hired chiefs, an Indian affairs bureaucracy, and a small bourgeoisie. All three shams from the very beginning to the end, which served as go-betweens. In this unending colony, the truth stood naked, but the settlers preferred it hidden away, or at least dressed. The natives had to love them all. They had done. Something in the way a cruel father is still loved by the child who are wounded by his selfish hands. The white elite undertook to manufacture a native elite. They picked promising youths. They made them drink the fire-water principles of capitalism and of Western culture. They educated the Indian out of them, and their heads were filled with their mouths, were stuffed with smart-sounding hypocrisies, grand, greedy words that stuck in their throats but which they spit out nonetheless. After a short stay in the universities, they were sent home to the reserves or unleashed in the cities, whitewashed. These walking lies had nothing to say to their brothers and sisters that did not sound false, ugly, and harmful. They only mimicked their masters. From buildings in Toronto, from Montreal, from Vancouver, businessmen would utter the words, development, progress. And somewhere on a reserve lips would open, oatmeal, grass. The natives were complacent and compliant. It was a rich time for the white elite. Then things changed. The mouths of natives started opening by themselves. Brown voices still spoke of the whites' law, democracy, and liberal humanism, but only to reproach them for their unfairness and inhumanity. White elites listened without displeasure to these polite statements of resentment and reproach, these pleas for reconciliation, with apparent satisfaction. See, just like we taught them, they are able to talk in proper English without the help of a priest or of an anthropologist. Just look at what we made out of the backward savages. They sound like lawyers. Whites did not doubt that the natives would accept their ideals, since the natives accused the whites of not being faithful to them. Settlers could still believe in the sanctity of their divine civilizing mission. They had Europeanized the natives. They had created a new kind of native, the assimilated Aboriginal. The white elites took this all in and whispered, quiet between themselves over dinner, as good progressive persons of the post-modern world. Let them cry and complain. It's just therapy and worth the expense. It's better than giving the land back. I like that part. Now the sham is coming to an end. Native thinkers and leaders are coming on the scene intent on changing things entirely. With the last stores of our patience, native writers, musicians, and philosophers are trying to explain to settlers that their values and the true facts of their existence are at great odds, and that the native can never be completely erased or totally assimilated. This new indigenous intelligentsia trying to get settlers to understand that colonialism must and will be confronted and destroyed. It is not 1947. We're not talking about reforming the Indian Act so that it can become little municipalities. It is not 1982. We're not talking about going to court to explore empty constitutional promises. Give it back, you fucks, exactly. It is the 21st century. Listen, quote, what is treated in the Canadian discourse of reconciliation as an unhealthy and deliberating incapacity to forgive and move on, is actually a sign of critical consciousness, of our sense of justice and injustice, and of our awareness of and willingness to reconcile. Truthard is talking about rising up, seeing red, about resurgence and the politics of authentic self-affirmation. This is a call to combat contemporary colonialism's objectification and alienation and manipulation of our true selves. He understands that in Canada today, settlement, quote unquote, of conflict means putting the past behind us, a willful forgetting of the crimes that have stained the psyche of this country for so long, a conspiracy of collective ignorance, turning a blind eye to the ongoing crimes of theft, fraud, and abuse against the original people of the land that are still the unacceptable everyday reality in Canada. So how could we settle and accept and not question and challenge the naturalized injustice that frames and shapes and gives character to our lives? There's nothing natural about the dominance of white people on the North American continent and the removal and erasure of our people, our laws, and our cultures from our homelands. Glenn Coulthard is a leading voice of the new indigenous intelligentsia, and he has accomplished so much with this book. To have rescued Karl Marx from his 19th century hostage chamber in that room in the British Library, and to expose him to the full breadth of history and the light of the human landscape was enough to make this a great work of political theory. He's gone beyond that accomplishment in correcting John Paul Sartre's and Frantz Fanon's narrow vision, something you have to excuse them for given they were doing philosophy while in the midst of a ferocious physical fight, and brought Marx, Sartre, Fanon together with his Dane elders, and me and you, reader, to show us all how our psycho-affective attachments to colonialism are blocking the achievement of a just society. As such, this book is a profound critique of contemporary colonialism and clear vision of indigenous resurgence, and a serious contribution to the literature of freedom. Have our acknowledgements. Alright, Juche gang. Introduction. Subjects of Empire. Perfect emote, Frank. As they say, canvas can do, but Satchery is smarter tree. You had to. I know you had to. I get it. Feel ya. Subjects of Empire. Real recognition of our presence and humanity would require a genuine reconsideration of so many people's role in North American society that it would amount to a genuine leap of imagination. George Manuel and Michael Poslin, Fourth World. From the words of the state to subjects of recognition. Over the last 40 years, the self-determination efforts and objectives of Indigenous peoples in Canada have increasingly been cast in the language of quote-unquote recognition. Consider, for example, the formative declaration issued by my people in 1975. We, the Dene of Northwest Territories, insist on the right to be regarded by ourselves and the world as a nation. Our struggle is for the recognition of the Dene Nation by the government and people of Canada and the peoples and governments of the world. And while there are realities we are forced to submit to, such as the existence of a country called Canada, we insist on the right to self-determination and recognition of the Dene Nation. Now fast forward to 2005 policy position. Self-determination issues by Canada's largest Aboriginal organization, the Assembly of First Nations, AFN. According to the AFN, a consensus has emerged around a vision of the relationship between First Nations and Canada could lead to strengthening recognition and implementation of First Nations governments. This vision, quote unquote, the AFN goes on to explain, draws on the core principles outlined in the 1996 report for the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, RCAP. That is, recognition of the nation-to-nation relationship between First Nations and the Crown, recognition of the equal rights of First Nations to self-determination, recognition of the Crown's fiduciary obligation to protect Aboriginal treaty rights, recognition of First Nations' inherent right to self-government, and recognition of the right of First Nations to economically benefit from the use and development of their lands and resources. Since 2005, the AFN has consistently reasserted and affirmed these guiding principles at its annual General Assemblies and in the numerous resolutions that these gatherings have produced. The demands have not been easy to ignore because of the persistence and dedication of countless Indigenous activists, leaders, communities, organizations. We have witnessed within the scope of for 4 decades the emergence of an unprecedented degree of recognition for Aboriginal quote-unquote cultural rights within the legal and political framework of the Canadian state. Most significant on this front was Canada's eventual recognition of existing Aboriginal and treaty rights under Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. This constitutional breakthrough provided the catalyst that led to the federal government's eventual recognition in 1995 of an inherent right to self-government, as well as the groundswell of a post-1982 court challenges that have sought to both clarify and widen the scope of what constitutes a constitutionally recognized Aboriginal right to begin with. When considered from the vantage point of these important developments, it would certainly appear that the recognition has emerged as the dominant expression of self-determination within the Aboriginal rights movement in Canada. The struggle for recognition has become a central catalyst in the international indigenous rights movements as well. As the works of Will Kamilika, Cheryl Lightfoot, Ronald Neisen, and others have noted, the last 3 decades have witnessed an emergence of recognition-based approaches to indigenous self-determination in the field of indigenous state relations in Asia, Northern Europe, throughout the Americas, and across the South Pacific, including Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. Although varying in institutional scope and scale, all of these geopolitical regions have seen the establishment of indigenous rights regimes that claim to recognize and accommodate the political autonomy, land rights, cultural distinctiveness of indigenous nations within the settler states that now encase them. Although my primary empirical focus in red skin, white masks is Canada, I suspect that readers will find many of my conclusions applicable to settler colonial experiences elsewhere. John, in other words, we're done talking nicely. We're just gonna take it now. Exactly, John. Fucking exactly. On a more discursive plane, the increase in recognition demands made by the indigenous and other marginalized minorities over the last 40 years also prompted a flurry of intellectual activity that has sought to unpack these complex ethical, political, legal questions that these types of claims raise. To date, much of this literature has tended to focus on perceived relationship between the affirmative recognition and institutional accommodation of societal cultural differences on the one hand, and the freedom of autonomy, marginalized individuals and groups living in ethnically diverse states on the other. Sorry, Frank, can't do it. In Canada, it has been argued that this synthesis of theory and practice has forced the state to dramatically reconceptualize the tenets of its relationship with Indigenous peoples. Whereas before 1969, federal Indian policy was unapologetically assimilist. Now, it is approached with the vernacular of mutual recognition. In other words, they are scared like Frank is. Yeah, all of what this book says about First Nations in Canada can be extrapolated to the US with American Indians, with few to no changes to the bodywork. Definitely. I could see that 100%. In the following chapters, I critically engage a multiplicity of diverse anti-imperialist traditions and practices to challenge the increasingly commonplace idea that the colonial relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state can be adequately transformed via such a politics of recognition. Following the work of Richard J. F. Day, I take, quote, politics of recognition to refer to the now expansive range of recognition-based models of liberal pluralism that seeks to quote-unquote reconcile indigenous assertions of nationhood with settler state sovereignty via the accommodation of indigenous identity claims, some form of renewed legal political relationship with the Canadian state. Although these models tend to vary in both theory and practice, most call for a delegation of land, capital, and political power from the state to indigenous communities through a combination of land claim settlements, economic development initiatives, self-government agreements. These are subsequently the 3 broad contexts through which I examine the theory and practice of indigenous recognition politics in the following chapters. Against this variant of the recognition approach, I argue that instead of ushering in an era of peaceful coexistence grounded on the ideal of reciprocity, mutual recognition, the politics of recognition in its contemporary liberal form promises to produce the very configurations of colonialist, racist, patriarchal state power that indigenous peoples' demand for recognition have historically sought to transcend. To demonstrate the above claim, red skin, white mass were theoretically and empirically map the contours of what I consider to be a decisive shift in the modus operandi of colonial power, following the hegemonization of the recognition paradigm, following the release of the federal government's infamous Statement of the Government of Canada on Indian Policy, also known as the quote-unquote White Paper, 1969. In the 2 centuries leading to this historic policy proposal, which called for a blanket assimilation of the status Indian population by unilaterally removing all institutionally enshrined aspects of legal, political differentiation that distinguishes First Nations from non-Native Canadians, under the Indian Act, the reproduction of the colonial relationship between Indigenous peoples, what would eventually become Canada, depended heavily on the deployment of state power geared around genocidal practices of forced exclusion and assimilation. Any cursory examination into the character of colonial Indian policy during this period will attest to this fact. For example, this era witnessed Canada's repeated attempts to overtly uproot and destroy the vitality and autonomy of Indigenous modes of life through institutions such as residential schools, through the imposition of settler state policies aimed at explicitly undercutting Indigenous political economies and relations to and with land, through the violent dispossession of First Nations women's rights to the land and community membership under sexist provisions of the Indian Act. We can talk about how actually my grandmother's ancestors, their community was destroyed under this act, my grandmother's parents, because their community was like headed by women, and so therefore it was not recognized. Through the theft of Aboriginal children via racist child welfare policies, through the near wholesale dispossession of Indigenous peoples' territories and modes of traditional governance in exchange for delegated administrative power to be exercised over relatively minuscule reserve lands. Right, yeah, how did they be matriarchal? However the fuck you say it. Yeah, they didn't let, therefore it wasn't recognized because, yeah, as we all know, settlers were far behind native people when it came to, well, recognizing gender, sexuality, etc. Just leaps and bounds behind us. Motherfuckers need to get a scientific understanding of that shit already. All of these policies sought to marginalize Indigenous people and communities with the ultimate goal being their elimination, if not physically, then as cultural, political, and legal peoples distinguishable from the rest of Canadian society. These initiatives reflect more or less the unconcealed, unilateral, and coercive nature of colonial rule during most of the 19th and 20th centuries. Although Indigenous people and communities have always found ways to individually and collectively resist these oppressive policies and practices, it was not until the tumultuous political climate of red power activism in the 1960s and 70s that policies geared towards the recognition, so-called reconciliation, native land and political grievances with state sovereignty began to appear. 3 watershed events are generally recognized as shaping this era of native activism in Canada. First was the materialization of widespread First Nation opposition to the previously mentioned 1969 White Paper. Instead of serving as a bridge to passive assimilation, the White Paper inaugurated an unprecedented degree of pan-Indian assertiveness, political mobilization. The National Indian Brotherhood, now the Assembly of First Nations, issued the following response to the federal government's proposed initiative. We view this policy designed to divest us of our Aboriginal rights. We accept this policy, and in the process lose our rights and our lands. We become willing partners in cultural genocide. This we cannot do, unquote. Though designed as a once-and-for-all solution to Canada's so-called Indian problem, quote unquote, the White Paper instead became a central catalyst around which the contemporary Indigenous self-determination movement coalesced, launching it into a determinant of a unique central cultural heritage and identity. The sheer magnitude of First Nations resistance to the White Paper proposal forced the federal government to formally shelve the document on March 17, 1971. AFN had a very disappointing turn into reaction. Yeah, unfortunately, look at same with me, AIM and Russell Means, right? It's fucking tragic, but it's God. Wish it was more surprising when it happened. That's all I could say about that. The second watershed event occurred following the partial recognition of Aboriginal title in the Supreme Court of Canada 1973 Calder decision. This landmark case, which involved a claim launched by Niska's hereditary chief Frank Calder to an unextinguished territories of his nation, northwestern British Columbia, overturned a 75-year precedent first established in St. Catharines Milling and Lumber Company versus the Queen in 1888, which stated that Aboriginal land rights existed only insofar and to the extent that the state recognized them as such. Oh. That hurt me a little bit to read that last part. Though technically a defeat for the Niskas, the 6 justices that rendered the substantive decision in Calder all agreed that, prior to contact, the Niskas indeed held the land right they claimed in court. The question then quickly shifted to whether these rights were sufficiently extinguished through colonial legislation. What the fuck? This is the most cursed fucking group of words I've ever read. Whether the rights were sufficiently extinguished. Excuse me? Clearly not. If someone's there fighting against it, I'm gonna say, no, it's not sufficiently extinguished. You fucks. It's pretty fucking clear, cut and dry, isn't it? Yeah, right? Imagine being basically a sovereign country within a country and having to ask to use your own lands. And that's one problem with basically a lot of what the settler communist parties, like even the CPC, what they want to do, right? Is like basically implement this thing where they just want to replace their first step or whatever is proposed to be the replacing of the House of Senate or whatever with the House of Nations. But unless every single First Nation has the right to veto, then it's a complete sham, right? It's just hollow unless every First Nation has the right to veto any other decision, like by a non-First Nation. That's the only way that works. In the end, 3 justices ruled that the Aboriginal rights in question had not been extinguished. Well, isn't that nice of them? 3 ruled they had. Well, that's not so nice of them. And 1 justice ruled against Niskras based on the technical question regarding whether this type of action could be leveled against the province without legislating permitting it, which he ruled could not. Thus, even though Niskas technically lost their case in a 4-3 decision, the Supreme Court's ruling in Calder left enough uncertainty around the question of existing Aboriginal rights that it prompted a shift in the federal government's policy vis-a-vis native land interests. The fucking legals. The way the settlers do the whole legal thing with this setting the precedent shit is it's so ridiculous, if you ask me. You know what I mean? Like the way it's like, oh, and that you call back to these other cases as examples, and it's always like, well, they did it this way back in 1982, so therefore we should make this decision the same way today in 2023. Like, what the fuck kind of sense does that make? It's just like the Constitution, how they have to hold on to that old constitutional document, right? It's this reflection of always having to live into the past and try and keep development from happening, essentially. It's a beautiful reflection of exactly that. I mean, not beautiful as in it's pretty, but it's just a perfect reflection to use as an example. It's the opposite of pretty, in case you didn't gather that. Trying to get some of this butter in here, hold on. Yeah, settler parties have a lot of fucking problems. Just put it as lightly as I possibly can, Sean. The result was the federal government's 1973 Statement on Claims of Indian and Inuit People, the Federal Native Claims Policy, which effectively reversed 52 years since the 1921 signing of Treaty 11 in the Northwest Territories with the Dene, state refusal to recognize indigenous claims to land where the question of existing title remained open. Third event, or rather cluster of events, emerged following the turbulent decade of energy politics that followed the oil crisis in the early 1970s, which subsequently fueled an aggressive push by state and industry to develop what it saw as the largely untapped resource potential, natural gas, minerals, and oil of northern Canada. Federal government's holding of 40% equity of the Pan-Arctic oils led Indian Affairs Minister Jean Chrétien. What? Is this him? Wait a second. Really? Is it who I'm thinking of? Wait a second. Hold on, chat. It is Frank? Okay, I thought so. That's him, all right. Right on. That's what I thought when I read it. I was like, that's what I read his name exactly perfectly. I was like, wait. We're talking about that fucking bastard, aren't we? Yeah, now it's all coming back. Okay, Pan-Arctic Oil's led Indian Affairs Minister Jean Chrétien to state that, quote, it is very seldom in public life that a minister of a government presides over that kind of profit, end quote. Ah, remind me how much I hate Jean Chrétien. Jesus. The proposed increase in northern development was envisioned despite concerns raised by Métis, Dene, and Inuit of the Northwest Territories regarding Canada's proposal to sanction the development of huge natural gas pipeline to be carved across the heartland of our traditional territories, as well as the resistance mounted by the Cree of northern Quebec against the similarly massive hydroelectric project proposed for their homeland in the James Bay region. The effectiveness of her subsequent political struggles, which gained unprecedented media coverage across the country, once again raised the issue of unresolved Native rights and title issues to the fore of Canadian public consciousness. French name opinions discarded. Oh yeah, you can go right ahead and discard Jean Chrétien. For sure. Fucking Jean Chrétien. He had a French face too, let me tell you, Sean. Didn't he, Frank? Perhaps one of the Frenchest faces I've ever seen. The following chapters, I will show that colonial rule underwent a profound shift in the wake of these important events. Hoy, he says. More specifically, I argue that the expression of indigenous anti-colonial nationalism that emerged during this period forced colonial power to modify itself from a structure that was once primarily reinforced by policies, techniques, ideological, explicitly oriented around the genocidal exclusion, assimilation double, to one that is now reproduced through a seemingly more conciliatory set of discourses and institutional practices that emphasize our recognition and accommodation. Regardless of this modification, however, the relationship between indigenous peoples and the state has remained colonial to its foundation. Extremely punchable fit. Okay. Yeah, this is Jean Chrétien. What do you think, Sean? You tell me. You tell me whether you think that's a punchable face or not, comrade. This is him when he's talking. Let's try it and find out. Shot. Didn't he get hit with a cream pie? Yeah. Yeah, something like that. Someone second now. Someone did do that.
As John Jeffrey reports.
Late this morning, Prime Minister John Chrétien arrived at the Old Home Week Fair. There was only a small crowd and security was relaxed. This was just to be a photo opportunity for Chrétien. No one expected what happened almost immediately. Police arrested 23-year-old Evan Brown, a member of a new group calling itself the
Evan
PEI
Brown
High
did
Brigade.
nothing wrong.
Government was made accountable. Because it sure as hell doesn't happen in this country. What's your name? What's the problem? My name's Evan Brown. What's my problem? I think just about everybody in this country has a problem.
Aaron Colazar is another member of the group.
One of the representatives of the PEI Pie Brigade has put a pie in the face of Jean Chrétien, a direct hit I might add, and this is for all of Jean Chrétien's social crimes, but in particular because he is force-feeding genetically engineered food on the public of Canada without any testing.
After a brief visit to the wash.
Good old pie to the face. Karl Marx, settler colonialism and indigenous dispossession in post-white paper Canada. I guess this is still part of the introduction, yeah. What do I mean by a colonial, or more precisely settler-colonial relationship? A settler-colonial relationship is one characterized by a particular form of domination. That is, it is a relationship where power, in this case, interrelated, discursive, and non-discursive facets of economic, gendered, racial, and state power have been structured into a relatively secure, sedimented set of hierarchical social relations that continue to facilitate the dispossession of indigenous peoples of their lands, self-determining authority. In this respect, Canada is no different from most other settler colonial powers. In the Canadian context, colonial domination continues to be structurally committed to maintain, through force, fraud, more recently, so-called quote-unquote negotiations, ongoing state access to the land and resources that contradictorily provide the material and spiritual substance of indigenous societies on the one hand, and the foundation of colonial state formation, settlement, capitalist development on the other. As Patrick Wolfe states, quote, whatever settlers may say, and they generally have a lot to say, the primary motive of settler colonialism is not race or religion, ethnicity, grade of civilization, etc., but access to territory. Territoriality is settler colonialism's specific, irreducible element. Unquote. GMO is worried the pie people were going to be weird fascists. Yeah. Yeah. They sounded a little bit liberal, to be fair. They weren't mad about, his treatment of First Nations people or anything, but I digress. Can't expect perfection, I suppose. Yeah, I'm with exactly what Frank got beat me to that sentiment, actually. In thinking about colonialism as a form of structured dispossession, I have found it useful to return to a cluster of insights developed by Karl Marx, chapters 26 through 32, first volume of Capital. This section of Capital is crucial because it is there that Marx more thoroughly links the totalizing power of capital with that of colonialism, by way of his theory of primitive accumulation. Challenge the idyllic portrayal of capitalism's origins by economists like Adam Smith. Marx's chapters on primitive accumulation highlight the gruesomely violent nature of the transition from feudal to capitalist social relations in Western Europe, with an emphasis placed on England, of course. Marx's historical excavation of the birth of the capitalist mode of production identifies a host of colonial-like state practices that serve to violently strip, through conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, quote-unquote, non-capitalist producers, communities, and societies from their means of production and substance. In Capital, these formation acts of violent dispossession set the stage for the emergence of capitalist accumulation, the reproduction of capitalist relations of production by tearing indigenous societies, peasants, and other small-scale, self-sufficient agricultural producers from the source of their livelihood, the land. It was this horrific process that established the two necessary preconditions underwriting the capital relation itself. It forcibly opened up what were once collectively held territories and resources to privatization, dispossession, and enclosure, which, over time, came to produce a quote-unquote class of workers compelled to enter the exploitative realm of labor market for their survival, proletarianization. The historical process of primitive accumulation thus refers to the violent transformation of non-capitalist forms of life into capitalist ones. The critical purchase of Marx's private accumulative thesis for the critical purchase of Marx's primitive accumulation thesis for analyzing the relationship between colonial rule, capitalist accumulation, and the contemporary period has been the subject of much debate over the last couple decades. Within and between the fields of indigenous studies and Marxist political economy, these debates have at times been hostile and polarizing. At its worst, the hostility has led to the premature rejection of Marx and Marxism by some indigenous studies scholars at one side, and to belligerent, often ignorant, and sometimes racist dismissal of indigenous peoples' contributions to radical thought and politics by Marxists on the other. Okay, okay, Sean, yes. I love what you're saying there because this is something that this is okay. So what Sean just said here is such a it's a good comment. Glenn Coulthard's critique of Marx is why I reject the idea of capitalism is a necessary step for socialism communism. We were already headed that way before we got invaded. And yeah, I totally agree with that. And that's one reason why that's one reason why we study Juche, right? Because unlike Marxism, which as we all know, the famous quote is all of what is it? Is it all of civilized history or all of known history, written history? It's something like that. Is the history of class struggle, right? But that only applies to class societies. You see, First Nations in a lot of different places were classless societies, right? And had class-based society violently introduced on them. And I think it's a little bit reductive and mechanical to simply say that those First Nations societies would have inevitably had capitalism emerge. And actually, this is something that Lenin fought against himself, Sean. Lenin fought against this idea, and so did Kim Jong Il and Kim Il Sung, of course. And the reason why Lenin had to fight against this idea was because that idea is what led, first Kautsky, but then it also led to the Social Democrats in his own country taking the stance that, well, we have to wait for capitalism to develop here in Russia before we can even think about taking state power, right? I'm trying to find where I saw that because it's a good quote. Got a new chatter here. Welcome in, comrade. My mother has been angry with me this morning. And role playing as a wild caribou until she suddenly burst into the room and said, "What the fuck are you doing?" Proceeded to let loose a hearty roar and ran. Wall. Father had expected this. His minefield was in place, and this last time front a caribou. What the hell did I just read? Frank, you might want to. we might need to investigate. Chat, get to investigating here. I'm looking for this fucking quote. What the hell did I just read out loud? Yeah, there's that. Where is it? Bothering me that I can't find it. Let me see if I search for it. Oh, of course not. I know it's somewhere. Here it is, right here. This is it. What I was looking for. You say that civilization is necessary for building of socialism. Very good. But why could we not first create such prerequisites of civilization in our country by the expulsion of the landowners, the Russian capitalists, and then start moving towards socialism? Where, in what books have you read that such variations of the customary historical sequences of events are impermissible or impossible? Lenin. And he was arguing this, of course, because this was a pressing question in their time because you had this country where capitalism wasn't fully developed. Yeah, that might be from State and Revolution. And I mean, even Marx, he mentioned that like capitalism on the grand scale might have been a progressive thing, although Kim Jong Il like doesn't like to put it even that way for obvious reasons. But to say that everywhere that capitalism breaks out after that is progress is a misnomer, and I think is actually a misinterpretation of what Marx is actually saying. Like personally, I don't think he meant that capitalism has to break out everywhere in order for those places to then go on to socialism. Just the fact that capitalism broke out anywhere in the world, because the world is a connected dialectical place, then allows for the emergence of capitalism to break out everywhere in the world. Yeah, exactly. Which is why, and Frank, I agree. I think it's a clarification of Marx by Lenin because that's why he says, you know, where and what books did you read, right? Because what he's saying is that Marx wasn't saying what you think he's saying. What books did you read that in? You capitalism would have been progressive for mercantile societies because that was the next step of the. Yeah, in the framework, in the context of feudalism, yes, exactly. Now, without the interference by settlers, who knows what direction or what sort of stages of society a lot of First Nations would have taken. But I mean, that's a conversation for another time, right? But what we know is that since their interference, now we have to get to this stage where we have to completely eliminate settler colonialism, and then we can go on to build a socialist society here on the ruins of that settler colonialism. Yeah, and of course Marx's main focus was really in Europe, right? Even insofar as he was critiquing when developing his own theories and philosophy, he was really critiquing even other bourgeois philosophers and bourgeois writers, which is something, you know, we actually learn. We hear Kim Jong Il talk a lot about. John, you definitely got to come in when we're reading the next Kim Jong Il stuff because I think you'll really connect with some of what he says. He really like just puts he because in the way that Marx like in the way Marx developed his own philosophy by critiquing the existing bourgeois philosophies, leaves like a little leftover of them in it, right? Then Kim Jong Il comes along and removes the rest of it. All right, Sean, enjoy work as much as you can. You know that's hard to do for a lot of people. Hope it's a good one though. Come hang out again, comrade. Salute. I will stream, and by the way, tomorrow will be a nighttime stream. If you check out my schedule, I changed it all, so you can set notifications or whatever. That's the schedule I'm going with for the next while. Tomorrow, I'll be starting at 10 my time. I don't know what that is your time, but if you check my schedule, you can see what it is. Yeah, I do too sometimes, Frank. Like I wonder, you know, is he a little bit of a because he's a little bit snarky anyway, it feels like, right? I don't know. At their non-dogmatic best, however, I believe that the conversations that continue to occur within and between these two diverse fields of critical inquiry, especially when placed in dialogue with feminist, anarchist, queer, and post-colonial traditions, have the potential to shed much insight into the cycles of colonial domination, resistance, that characterize the relationship between white settler states and indigenous peoples. To my mind, then, hey, welcome. We're reading this work here, Indigenous American Redskin White Mass, Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition by Glenshon Coulthard. Of course, we always like to talk about the works as we're reading them. So you might have caught me at the tail end of a little bit of a rant there. To my mind, then, for indigenous peoples to reject or ignore the insights of Marx would be a mistake, especially if this amounts to a refusal on our part to critically engage his important critique of capitalist exploitation and his extensive writing on the entangled relationship between capitalism and colonialism. Are there any non-white colonial projects? I don't know. Not that I really know of. White is not really, because it's not really an ethnicity, right? White itself is a contrast, is a social construct that really just describes your relation to imperialism and colonialism. I mean, yeah, that is an example that existed before, but of course, Japan no longer has colonization of Korea anymore, right? There's examples in the past for sure. But that has pretty much changed now thanks to the US. I mean, there might be small scale ones in other parts of the world, but yeah. For the most part, when we're talking about colonization, we're talking about that construct that has the favorable relation to colonization. As Tizimshan anthropologist Charles Menzies writes, yeah, exactly, Frank. That's well put. The empire is not white inherently. It's just the nature it has in the age of modern racial capitalism, exactly, and imperialism, etc. In current G7 American-led imperialist world that we live in. So Charles Menzies writes, quote, Marxism retains an incisive core that helps understand the dynamics of the world we live in. It highlights the ways in which power is structured through ownership and exposes the state's role in the accumulation of capital and redistribution of wealth from the many to the few. We don't have any Trotsky on here, sorry. All of this is not to suggest, however. I'll give you a Trotsky quote. Hold on a sec. All of this is not to suggest, however, that Marx's contributions are without flaw, nor is it meant to suggest that Marxism provides a ready-made tool for indigenous people to uncritically appropriate in their struggle for land and freedom. As suggested above, rendering Marx's theoretical frame relevant to the comprehensive understanding of settler colonialism and indigenous resistance requires that it be transformed in conversation with the critical thought and practices of indigenous peoples themselves. In the spirit of fostering this critical dialogue, I suggest that three problematic features of Marx's primitive accumulation theses are in need of such a transformation. Right, I'll give you your commie quote. Here comes a Trotsky commie quote for you. Ready. Someone just paid for a comic quote and they requested Trotsky quote.
Hey, this guy's a commie! Commie, traitor to our country!
Oh shit. Thank you so much, 2023, for the gift sub to Vivian. Awesome. Now Vivian has the badass little pictures. Press F to pay respect, chat, to 2023. Trotsky's permanent quote-unquote revolution is, as Lenin said, skipping the peasant movement, playing at the seizure of power. Why is it dangerous? Because such a revolution, if an attempt had been made to bring it about, would inevitably have ended in failure. For it would have divorced from the Russian proletariat its ally, the poor peasantry. This explains the struggle that Leninism has been waging against Trotsky ever since 1905. There you go, there's your Trotsky quote. Hope you liked it. That was the best one I could find that's about permanent revolution and also Trotsky. That's the closest one I have. See, I searched Trotsky in my quotes folder. Comrade Trotsky's theses have landed him in a mess. That part which of them is correct is not new, and, what is more, turns against him. That which is new is all wrong. Based as Lenin. Damn. Lenin's spitting. Alright, there's a quote. I hope you enjoyed that. The first feature involves what many critics have characterized as Marx's rigidly temporal framing of the phenomenon. As early as 1899, for example, anarchist geographer Peter Kropotkin made note of what seemed to be an erroneous division drawn in Marx between the primary accumulation of capital and its present-day formulation. The critical point here, which many contemporary writers have subsequently picked up on, is that Marx tended to portray primitive accumulation as if it constituted a process confined to a particular period, one already largely past in England, but still underway in the colonies at the time Marx wrote. For Marx, although the era of violent state dispossession may have inaugurated the accumulation process, in the end, it is, quote, the silent compulsion of economic relations, unquote, that ultimately sets the seal on the domination of the capitalist over the worker. This formulation, however, clearly does not conform well to our present global reality. As the recent work of scholars as diverse as David Harvey, Fiduciary, Alfred, I can't say all these names, Jesus, Rana, and Andrea Smith, to name but a few, thank God he only named a few, have highlighted the escalating onslaught of violence, self-orchestrated enclosures following neoliberalism's ascent to hegemony, has unmistakably demonstrated the persistent role that unconcealed, violent dispossession continues to play in the reproduction of colonial and capitalist social relations in both the domestic and global contexts. The second feature that needs to be addressed concerns the normative developmentalism that problematically underscored Marx's original formulation of the primitive accumulation thesis. I stress quote-unquote original here because Marx began to reformulate this teleological aspect of his thought in the last decade of his life. And this reformulation has important implications with respect to how we ought to conceptualize the struggles of non-Western societies against the violence that has defined our encounter with colonial modernity. For much of his career, however, Marx propagated within his writings a typically 19th century modernist view of history and historical progress. See, that's interesting. He is recognizing here that Marx was starting to overcome this view later on in his life. But the fact remained that through much of his life and in as much of his work, that, of course, was there. This developmentalist ontology provided the overarching frame from which thinkers as diverse as Immanuel Kant, Hegel, John Stuart Mill, and Adam Smith sought to unpack, historically rank variation in, quote, human cultural forms and modes of production, according to each form's approximation to the full development of the human good, unquote. As Michael Hart and Antonio Negri put it, this modernist commitment often led Marx, along with Engels, to depict those non-Western societies deemed to be positioned at the lower end of this scale of historical and cultural development as people without history. Ah, and now we get to the thing. So, as people, quote unquote, without history, existing as separate from the development of capital and locked in an immutable present without the capacity for historical innovation. Oof. See, and that's the part. Again, he was starting to overcome that later in his life, but yeah, that's that part. That's what we're talking about. The people without history. And remember how I said you then have Juche comes along, who then says, all of hitherto's human society history is not class struggle. It's the struggle for independence. So you see, Juche improved on that limited analysis of Marxism. And this is why I always say that we need to, as Marxists, better separate the idea of historical materialism from the science of dialectical materialism. Okay? Now, keeping in mind what was just said in this, I read this quote to you guys all the time, but I want you comrades to now think about it in the context of what we just read. The Black Panther Party is a Marxist-Leninist party. Because we follow the dialectical method, we also integrate theory with practice. We are not mechanical Marxists. We are not historical materialists. Some people think they are Marxists when actually they are following the thoughts of Hegel. Some people think they are Marxist-Leninists, but they refuse to be creative and are therefore tied to the past. They are tied to a rhetoric that does not apply to the present set of conditions. They apply to a set of thoughts and approaches what we call flunkyism and dogma. I butchered the ending, but you get the idea. It's exactly what he's saying here, right? And this is very revealing of how limited Marx's historical materialism can be. And now this is not to deny historical materialism or to deny the contributions that it made in overcoming bourgeois reactionary ideas. However, we need to recognize that we can perfect this analysis of social history because it is not changing the science, right? Dialectical materialism is the science. We can premise our analysis on dialectical materialism and take a more human-centered analysis of social history. And by doing so, by staying premised by Marxism, we can then analyze societies where there was no class, where that Marx, as we just saw in this work, considered to be without history or unable to make historical innovation, which is completely untrue, right? Just because they were developing in a more harmonious way with the environment does not necessarily mean incapable of historical development. And again, we can speculate and go on and say, like, nobody knows if they would have developed a capitalist type mode of production. There's no evidence to support that was an inevitable outcome of all humans everywhere, you know? And that is the thing. And why is it not inevitable? Well, and here comes Juche again with another great thing, right? It's because although there can be the appearance of spontaneity in human development, because of, you know, people having a low level of consciousness of their own interests and their own surroundings. So there can appear to be this spontaneity in the development of human society, but in reality, the development of human society is itself a conscious effort done through the consciousness and the active activity of the people themselves, right? If you, how can you even argue against that? It's funny to me when I see Marxists who will deny this about Juche. And it's like, well, then who is changing society if not the people with their conscious thoughts? It's not individuals doing it, but it is it is the collective effort of people fighting for their own conscious efforts, right? Consciously trying to develop society. It's just that in a class-based society, you have the reactionaries trying to capture people with their own bourgeois reactionary ideas to justify the class society that they find themselves in, the position in class society they find themselves. But that doesn't discount what's the underlying process behind that, right? Yeah. Well, specifically when that's in Marx's concept of species being and his understanding of creative labor and his critique of the young Hegelians. Yeah. Yeah. Like I say, he was starting to even overcome this himself. Because I mean, Marx and Engels when they first started, and I know this will be pointed out in a future work too, but when Marx and Engels really started to apply dialectical materialism or create historical materialism, they themselves ran into many limitations of just trying to mechanically explain the development of society through this historical materialist lens alone. So they had to come up with certain rules that would overcome these limitations, right? Like for example, the rule that although the mind is a reflection of the world around it, it's not a simple reflection. I forget exact wording of it. But and the reason of course is because they're trying to overcome these reactionary bourgeois ideas that existed, which it did do a great benefit towards. But then Juche is able to go like, okay, I think they went a little bit, you know, in trying to be this certain way and trying to do this materialist analysis, they forgot to analyze humanity and what human beings' role and position is in that dialectical materialist world. That's the relation between Juche and Marxism. And that's why I think exactly this, like reading this reminds me of exactly why Juche alongside Marxism Leninism I think speaks to a lot of First Nations people in a way that Marxism alone doesn't, because it does remove those aspects of Marxism, right? You can say those aspects aren't inherent in Marx, and that's true, but you can make those interpretations when you read Marx, and that is a limitation, right? The less room for misinterpretation the work can lead, the better the better we can say that work is done, you know, at getting across the point. Yeah, I love that quote, Frank. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Exactly. And that is why Marxism is the guide to action. The dialectic, the dialectic is also a creative and dynamic process. And so many Marxists get so stuck in it that they'll even think they're doing dialectics, right? When really they're just like Comrade Huey Newton said, when they're still stuck in this like in the past, they think they're still doing these dialectics. Yeah, that's interesting. Cool. Sorry for that rant, but that I think that just like a light bulb went off in my head when I read that part. I was gonna wait till the end of the paragraph, but I couldn't. As a result, Marx's most influential work tends to not only portray primitive accumulation as a historical phenomenon, the sense that it constituted a prior or transitional stage, the development of the capitalist mode of production, but that it is also a historically inevitable process that would ultimately have a beneficial effect on those violently drawn into the capitalist circuit. Take, for instance, Marx's often quoted 1853 New York Tribune writings on colonial rule in India. There, he suggests that, although vile and barbaric in practice, colonial dispossession would nonetheless have a quote-unquote revolutionary effect on bringing the despotic, undignified, and stagnant life of the Indians into the fold of capitalist modernity, and thus onto the one true path of human development, socialism. Just as Hegel had infamously asserted before him that Africa exists at the threshold of world history, with no movement or development open to exhibit. Marx would similarly come to declare that Indian society has no history at all, at least no known history. Clearly, any analysis or critique of contemporary settler colonialism must be stripped of this Eurocentric feature of Marx's original historic meta-narrative. Reminds me of this graphic I made a while ago. This graphic I made a while ago was exactly the same thing. These exact things, see? Because of that. This was like these are like the general First Nations critiques of Marxism. At least, again, Marx might have been changing his mind by near the end of his life, but the fact remains that a lot of these ideas are still existent within his work that people today are studying. And that's the most important part. That's why it's still relevant to understand this and to study to overcome that. But this still raises the question of how to address the residual feature of Marx's analysis. For our purposes here, I suggest that this can be most effectively be accomplished by contextually shifting our investigation from an emphasis on the capital relation to the colonial relation. As suggested in his critical appraisal of Edward G. Wakefield's 1849 text, A View of the Art of Colonialization, Marx was primarily interested in colonialism because it exposed some truth about the nature of capitalism. His interest in the specific character of colonial domination was largely incidental. This is clearly evident in his position on primitive accumulation. As noted already, primitive accumulation involved a dual process for Marx. Accumulation of capital through violent state dispossession, resulting in proletarianization. The weight given to these constituent elements, however, is by no means equal in Marx, as he explicitly states in chapter 33 of Capital. Marx had little interest in the condition of the colonies as such. Rather, what caught his attention was, quote, the secret discovered in the New World by the political economy of the Old World, and loudly proclaimed by it that the capitalist mode of production and accumulation, and therefore capitalist private property as well, have for their fundamental condition the expropriation of the worker. Emphasis added. The expropriation of the worker. You get that? So I'm going to read the Marx quote one more time. The secret discovered in the New World by political economy of the Old World, loudly proclaimed by it, that the capitalist mode of production and accumulation, therefore capitalist private property as well, have for their fundamental condition the expropriation of the worker. When examined from this angle, colonial dispossession appears to constitute an appropriate object of critique and analysis only insofar as it unlocks the key to understanding the nature of capitalism. That capital is not a thing, but rather a social relation. dependent on the perpetual separation of workers from the means of production. This was obviously Marx's primary concern, and it has subsequently remained the dominant concern of Marx's tradition as a whole. The contextual shift advocated here, by contrast, takes as its analytical framework the subject possession of the colonized vis-a-vis the effects of colonial dispossession, rather than from the primary position of wage male proletariat, process of commodity production, quote unquote. To borrow Silvia Fredducci's useful formulation. At least 4 critical insights into our settler colonial present emerge from the resolution of these first 2 problems. First, by making the contextual shift in analysis from the capital relation to the colonial relation, the inherent injustice of colonial rule is posted on its own terms and in its own right. By repositioning the colonial frame as our overarching lens of analysis, becomes far more difficult to justify in antiquated developmental terms, from either the right or the left, the assimilation of non-capitalist, non-Western, indigenous modes of life based on the racist assumption this assimilation will somehow magically redeem itself by bringing the fruits of capitalist modernity into the supposedly quote-unquote backward world of the colonized. In a certain respect, this was also the guiding insight that eventually led Marx to reformulate his theory after 1871. Subsequently, in the last decade of his life, Marx no longer condemns non-Western and non-capitalist social formations to necessarily pass through the destructive phase of capitalist development as a condition of possibility for human freedom and flourishing. During this period, Marx had not only come to view more clearly how certain features of non-capitalist and capitalist modes of production articulate in a given social formation, but also the ways in which aspects of the former can come to inform the construction of radical alternatives to the latter. A similar insight informed Kropotkin's early critique of Marx as well. The problem for Kropotkin was that Marx not only drew on erroneous division between the history of state dispossession, what has proven to be its persistent role in the accumulation process, but that this also seemed to justify, in crude developmentalist terms, violent dispossession of place-based non-state modes, self-sufficient indigenous economic, political, and social activity. Only this time to be carried out under the auspices of the coercive authority of socialist states. This form of dispossession would eventually come to be championed by Soviet imperialists under the banner Socialist Primitive Accumulation. I suggest that by shifting our analytical frame to the colonial relation, we might occupy a better angle from which to both anticipate and interrogate practices of settler state dispossession, justified under otherwise egalitarian principles, and espoused with so-called progressive political agendas in mind. Instead, what must be recognized by those inclined to advocate a blanket return to the commons, unquote, as a redistributive counter-strategy to the neoliberal state's new round of enclosures is that in liberal settler states, such as Canada, the commons not only belongs to somebody, First Nations people of this land, they also deeply inform and sustain indigenous modes of thought and behavior that harbor profound insights to the maintenance of relationships within and between human beings and the natural world, built on principles of reciprocity, non-exploitation, and respectful coexistence. By ignoring or downplaying the injustices of colonial dispossession, critical theory, and left political strategy not only risk becoming complicit in the very structures and processes of domination that it ought to oppose, but it also risks overlooking what could provide an invaluable glimpse into the ethical practices and preconditions required for the construction of a more just, sustainable world order. Everyone follow along so far? Comments? Questions? All of this making sense? You know how I always, on this channel, several streams now, I always state that this speaks to the fact that you can't build a socialist state here on top of the colonial settler state. First, you have to dismantle that colonial state in what we call the democratic revolution. The second insight facilitated by this contextual shift has to do with the role played by Indigenous labor in the historical process of colonial capital accumulation in Canada. It is now generally acknowledged among historians and political economists that following the waves of colonial settlement that marked the transition between mercantile and industrial capitalism, roughly spanning the years 1860-1914, but with significant variation between geographical regions. Native labor became increasingly, although by no means entirely, superfluous to the political and economic development of the Canadian state. Increased European settlement combined with the imported, hyper-exploited non-European workforce meant that, in the post-fur trade period, Canadian state formation and colonial capitalist development required first and foremost land, and only secondarily the surplus value afforded by cheap Indigenous labor. This is not to suggest, however, that the long-term goal of indoctrinating the Indigenous population to the principles of private property, possessive individualism, menial wage work did not constitute an important feature of Canadian Indian policy. It did. As the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1890 wrote, quote, "The work of dividing reserves has begun in earnest. The policy of destroying the tribal or communist system is assailed in every possible way, and every effort has been made to implement the spirit of individual responsibility instead." Unquote. That quote's a little revealing, don't you think, Pat? When this historical consideration is situated alongside the contemporary fact that there has been first a steady increase in native migration to urban centers over the last few decades, and second, that many First Nations communities are situated on or near lands coveted by the resource exploitation industry, it is reasonable to conclude that displacing Indigenous life to the cold rationality of market principles will remain on state and an industry's agenda for some time to follow. In this respect, Marx's thesis still stands. What I want to point out, rather, is that when related back to the primitive accumulation thesis, it appears that the history and experience of dispossession, not proletarianization, has been the dominant background structure shaping the character, the historical relationship between Indigenous people and the Canadian state. Just as importantly, I would also argue that dispossession continues to inform the dominant modes of Indigenous resistance and critique that this relationship has provoked. Stated bluntly, the theory and practice of Indigenous anti-colonialism, including Indigenous anti-capitalism, is best understood as a struggle primarily inspired by and oriented around the question of land. A struggle not only for land in the material sense, but also deeply informed by what the land, as a system of reciprocal relations and obligations, can teach us about living our lives in relation to one another the natural world in non-dominating, non-exploitative terms, and less around our emergent status as rightless proletarians. I call this place-based foundation of indigenous decolonial thought and practice grounded normativity, by which I mean the modernalities of indigenous land-connected practices, long-standing experimental knowledge that inform and structure our ethical engagements around the world, and our relationships with human and non-human others over time. The third insight to flow from this contextual shift corresponds to the number of concerns expressed by indigenous peoples, deep ecologists, defenders of animal rights, and other advocates of environmental sustainability regarding the perceived anti-ecological tendencies in Marx's work. Although this field of criticism tends to be internally diverse, and some have argued overstated, I'm thinking here like eco-socialists like Joel Crowell and John Bellamy Foster. At its core, it suggests that Marxist perceptions on nature adhere to the instrumental rationality that placed no intrinsic value on the land or nature itself, and that this subsequently led him to be uncritically champion an ideology of productivism and unsustainable economic progress. From the vantage point of the capital relationship, which, I have argued, tends to concern itself most with the adverse structural and ideological effects stemming from the expropriated labor, land is not exploitable. People are. I believe that re-establishing that colonial relation of dispossession as a co-foundational feature of our understanding of the critical engagement with capitalism opens up the possibility of developing a more ecologically attentive critique of colonial capitalist accumulation, especially if this engagement takes its cues from the grounded normativity of indigenous modalities, of place-based resistance and criticism. And finally, the fourth insight that flows from the contextual shift advocated here involves what many have characterized as Marx's economic reductionism. It should be clear in the following pages that there is much more at play in the contemporary reproduction of settler colonial social relations than capitalist economies, most notably the host of interrelated yet semi-autonomous facets of decursive and non-decursive power, briefly identified earlier. Although it is beyond question that the predatory nature of capitalism continues to play a vital role in facilitating the ongoing dispossession of indigenous peoples in Canada, it is necessary to recognize that it only does so in relation to or in concert with axes of exploitation domination configured along racial, gender, and state lines. Given the resilience of these equally devastating modalities of power, I argue that any strategy geared towards authentic decolonization must directly confront more than mere economic relations. It has to account for the multifarious ways in which capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, and the totalizing character of state power interact with one another to form a constellation of power relations that sustain colonial patterns of behavior, structures, and relationships. I suggest that shifting our attention to the colonial frame is one way to facilitate this form of radical intersectional analysis. Seen from this light, the colonial relation should not be understood as a primary locus or base from which these other forms of repression flow, but rather as the inherited background field within which market, racist, patriarchal, and state relations converge to facilitate a certain power effect. In our case, the reproduction of hierarchical social relations that facilitate the dispossession of our lands and self-determining capacities. Like capital, colonialism as a structure of domination predicated on dispossession is not a thing, but rather the sum effect of the diversity of interlocking oppressive social relations that constitute it. When stated this way, it should be clear that shifting our position to highlight the ongoing effects of colonial dispossession in no way displaces questions of distributive justice or class struggle. Rather, it simply situates these questions more firmly alongside and in relation to the other sites and relations of power that inform our settled colonial present. Intersectional King. I love this. I love what I love what he says here too. About understanding that it's not as simple, because again, this really, thinking about the human-centered analysis that Juche gives us, you know, it really reminds me of that it's that this the idea of the base and the superstructure. Okay, I get that it's a useful way to, you know, visualize it, but it really is a simplistic thing when you think about it. And you can see where this mistake by the USSR then comes into play, that Kim Jong Il was, you know, critiquing in that work, found, what was it, Fundamentals of Revolutionary Party Building, that we read. And what he noted there was, of course, that the mistake USSR made was thinking that once they changed the base, i.e., once they created the socialist system, that it would just be a matter of time and people would themselves automatically become socialist people. And they doled out, as I say over and over, they just doled out pre-existing Marxist-Leninist works like a catechism, and never like actually created new theory for their conditions, right? And as a result of this, eventually those old ideas came back and were able to undermine the state and cause confusion, etc., until the USSR was overturned. So I think it's funny. I think it is correct in many ways. I think we need to get away from this simplistic analysis of base and superstructure and realize that both things are achieved through the struggle of human consciousness, right? And all we need to understand, what changing the base does is makes it easier for us to then change the superstructure. See, for example, without changing the base of having the capitalist state into a socialist state, it is very hard, of course, to build socialist means of production, socialist economy, right? Just as it is very difficult to overcome all of the backwards, or the reactionary bourgeois ideas, right? I think you should do revolutionary party building for YouTube. A good one to have around for folks, in my opinion. Yeah, I think I will do that one for YouTube. Comment. That is a good one to do, because it's one that not many people read, and it does go into all of the things that, you know, what led to the overthrow of USSR. And what's funny is, reading this makes me realize how many of these criticisms it speaks to itself, right? It's interesting how, like, you can see some of these things that they're hinting at in this really did lead to mistakes in the USSR and stuff. Like this misunderstanding of the relation between the base and the superstructure. Again, while it's a good visualization, led to this mistake that you could just change the base and the superstructure would just automatically flip over, right? When no, you actually have to actively change both. And I agree that here in our current society, you have to fight against it in order to even achieve that struggle against capital. Oh, awesome. Thank you so much, Common Opponent, for the 420 redemption. Oh. Thank you, Conrad. Very much appreciated. As I always say, when you see the 420 come up, smoke them if you got them. With these 4 insights noted, I can now turn to the third and final feature that needs to be addressed with respect to Marx's primitive accumulation theses. This one, which constitutes the core theoretical intervention, this book brings us back to my original claim that, in the Canadian context, colonial relations of power are no longer reproduced primarily through overtly coercive means, but rather through asymmetrical exchange of mediated forms of state recognition and accommodation. This is obviously quite different from the story Marx tells, where the driving force behind the dispossession and accumulation is initially that of violence. There's a relationship of brute force, of servitude, whose methods, Marx claims, are anything but idyllic. The strategic deployment of violent sovereign power, then, serves the primary reproductive function in the accumulation process in Marx's writings on colonialism. As Marx himself bluntly put it, these gruesome state practices are what thrust capitalism onto the world stage, quote, dripping from head to toe from every pore in blood and dirt, unquote. The question that needs to be asked in our context, however, and the question to which I provide an answer in the following chapters, is this. What are we to make of contexts where state violence no longer constitutes the regulative norm governing the process of colonial dispossession, as appears to be the case in abstinently tolerant, multinational, liberal settler polities such as Canada? Stated in Marx's own terms, if neither blood and fire, nor the silent compulsion of capitalist economics can adequately account for the reproduction of colonial hierarchies in liberal democratic contexts, what can? And here we go. Frantz Fanon, who I see a bunch of Marxists always claim as being Marxist, but he wasn't. He's a fantastic thinker, and he's the thinker that all Marxist-Leninists should study. But to call him a Marxist-Leninist is a little bit reductive and not entirely accurate. Short on time, but look forward to more Theory Thursday. Okay, comrade. Glad to see that you were here listening with us. Come check us again. Tomorrow is my late night stream. As I mentioned earlier, comrades, you might notice if you check my schedule now on the Twitches, you'll see I switched some scheduling around. Monday and Tuesday are now going to stay as the mornings, 9 o'clock my time. If you need to know what that is your time, check out my schedule on the Twitch page. And then Wednesday is going to be by noon, I will stream. And then these days, Thursdays, I will be streaming by 7 o'clock at night, my time. And then Fridays, I'm going to stream at 10 o'clock, my time. If you need to know what that is your time, again, check out my Twitches. Now we're on to the last part of the introduction here. We've been relating this work, by the way, Plants Fan, and we've been showing how Juche, relates a lot to this work. Been an eye-opening read so far already. Frantz Fanon and the Politics of Recognition in Colonial Contexts. To elucidate precisely how colonial rule made the transition from a more or less unconcealed structure of domination to a mode of colonial governmentality that works through the limited freedoms afforded by state recognition and accommodation, I will be drawing significantly, but not exclusively, on the work of anti-colonial theorist, psychiatrist, and revolutionary Frantz Fanon. At first blush, turning to Fanon to develop an understanding of the regulating mechanisms undergirding settler colonial rule in contexts where state violence no longer constitutes the norm, governing the process might seem a bit odd to those familiar with his work. After all, Fanon is arguably best known for his articulation of colonialism he develops in The Wretched of the Earth, which we will read on this channel as well, where colonial rule is foisted, much like Mars foisted it before him, as a structure of dominance maintained through the unrelenting and punishing forms of violence. In colonial regions, writes Fanon, the state uses language of pure violence. It does not alleviate oppression or mass domination. Instead, the proximity and frequent direct intervention by the police and military ensures that the colonizers are kept under close scrutiny, contained by rifle butts and napalm. And consider in Fanon wrote The Wretched of the Earth, during one of the 20th century's most gruesome anti-colonial struggles, the Algerian War of Independence, 1954-62, it is not surprising that he placed so much emphasis on colonialism's openly coercive and violent features. Given the severe nature of this colonial situation within which The Wretched of the Earth was produced, one could argue that the diagnosis and prescriptions outlined in the text were tragically appropriate to the context they set out to address. But this is simply not the case in contemporary Canada, and for this reason, I begin my investigation with the sustained engagement with Fanon's earlier work, Black Skin, White Masks. As we shall see in the following chapter, it is there that Fanon offers a groundbreaking critical analysis of the affirmative relationship drawn between recognition and freedom in the master-slave dialectic of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. Phenomenology of spirit, a critique I claim is equally applicable to contemporary liberal recognition-based approaches to Indigenous self-determination in Canada. Fanon's analysis suggests that in contexts where colonial rule is not reproduced through force alone, the maintenance of settler state hegemony requires the production of what he liked to call colonized subjects, namely the production of these specific modes of colonial thought, desire, and behavior that implicitly or explicitly commit the colonized to the types of practices and subject positions that are required for their continued domination. However, unlike the liberalized appropriation of Hegel that continues to inform many contemporary proponents of identity politics, in Fanon, recognition is not foisted as the source of freedom and dignity for the colonized, but rather as a field of power through which colonial relations are produced and maintained. This is the form of recognition, Fanon suggests, that Hegel never described. Subsequently, this is also the form of recognition that I set out to interrogate in Red Skin, White Mask. With these preliminary remarks made, I will now provide a brief outline of the structure and chapter breakdown of the book. Chapter 1, I use Frantz Fanon's critique of Hegel's master-slave dialectic to challenge the now commonplace assumption that the structure of domination that frames Indigenous state relations in Canada can be undermined via liberal politics of recognition. I begin my analysis by identifying two Hegelian assumptions that continue to inform the politics of recognition today. The first, which is now uncontroversial, involves recognition's perceived role in the constitution of human subjectivity. The notion that our identities are formed intersubjectively through our complex social interactions with other subjects. As Charles Taylor influentially asserts, the, quote, crucial feature of human life is its fundamentally dialogical character. We define our identity always in dialogue with, sometimes in struggle against, the things our significant others acknowledge in us. Unquote. The second, more contentious assumption suggests that the specific structural or personal character of our relations of recognition can have a positive when mutual and affirmative, or detrimental when unequal and disparaging, effect on our status as free and self-determining agents. I drew off Fanon's work to partially challenge this second assumption by demonstrating the ways in which the purportedly diversity-affirming forms of state recognition and accommodation defended by some proponents of contemporary liberal recognition politics can subtly reproduce non-mutual and unfair relations rather than fair and mutual ones. Charles Taylor's book on social imaginaries is quite good. I cited it before. Yeah, I might have to check that one out at some point. I've heard of this. At its core, Fanon's critique of colonial recognition politics can be summarized like this. When delegated exchanges of recognition occur in real-world contexts of domination in terms of accommodation, usually end up being determined by and in the interests of the hegemonic partner in the relationship. This is the structural problem of colonial recognition identified by Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks. Fanon then goes on to demonstrate how subaltern populations often develop what he calls quote-unquote psychoactive attachments to these structurally circumscribed modes of recognition. For Fanon, these ideological attachments are essential in maintaining the economic and political structure of colonial relationships over time. This is the subjective dimension to the problem of colonial recognition highlighted in Black Skin, White Masks. With these two interrelated problematics identified, I go on to conclude the chapter with a brief discussion of the alternative politics of recognition, one that is less oriented around attaining legal and political recognition by the state, and more about the indigenous peoples empowering themselves through cultural practices of individual and collective self-fashioning that seek to reconfigure radical alternatives to structural and subjective dimensions of colonial power identified earlier in the chapter. I call this a resurgent politics of recognition, and take it up in more detail in my concluding chapter. In chapters 2, 3, and 4, I set out empirically demonstrate the largely theoretical insights that are derived from my applied use of Fanon's critique of Hegel's master-slave narrative through 3 case studies drawn from the post-1969 history of Indigenous state relations in Canada. These case studies will also serve to flesh out in more detail a number of recent debates within the liberal recognition and identity politics literature, including those that have focused on following cluster of issues and concerns. The left materialist challenge. The ascendant status of identity, culture, and recognition in contemporary political struggles has not emerged without controversy. Critics on the left, for example, have long voiced concern over what they claim to be excessively insular, divisive character of many culture-based, identity-related movements. More specifically, they argue that the inherently patriarchal and particularistic orientation of recognition-based politics is serving to undermine more egalitarian and universal aspirations, like those focused on class and directed towards more equitable redistribution of socioeconomic goods. As Brian Barry explains, quote, pursuit of the multiculturalist agenda makes the achievement of broadly based egalitarian policies difficult in 2 ways. At a minimum, it diverts political effort away from universalistic goals, but a more serious problem is that multiculturalism may very well destroy the conditions for putting together a coalition in favor of across-the-board equalization of opportunities and resources. End quote. In such contests, it would indeed appear that recognition struggles are serving less to supplement, complicate, and enrich distribution struggles than to marginalize, eclipse, and displace them. As Nancy Fraser's work suggests, in short, advocates of the left materialist critique challenge the affirmative relationship drawn between recognition and freedom by many defenders of identity difference politics on the grounds that such of politics has proven itself incapable of transforming the generative material conditions that so often work to foreclose the realization of self-determination in the lives of ordinary citizens. We get to learn about the important role of intersectionality, chat. Oh, that's right. We're pro that on this channel. Read the tags for the channel, motherfuckers. Love his comments on multiculturalism. Agreed, Fannin. Agreed. We got Plants Fannin in the house. Fantastic comrade that everyone should absolutely follow on Twitter, by the way, if you don't. Fannin's Twitter takes are just fire. You're missing out if you don't follow him. I'll say that much. Chapter 2 interrogates the above challenge through the examination of the cultural, political, and economic dynamics that inform the Dene Nation's struggle for national recognition and self-determination in the 1970s and early 1980s. What do we got? We got a fire tweet here, Fannin? Yeah, there we go. Follow this. That's what everybody needs to be following. I see that now. By the way, I'm sorry, I gotta open that again. Making me hungry, plants. During this period, the Dene Nation was the main organization representing the political interests of the Dene people.
Let's go, Smokes. Let's go, Smokes.
Exactly. Of the Northwest Territories, of which my own community is part. Although sensitivities to certain concerns animating the left materialist position, I argue that there is nothing intrinsic to the identity-related struggles of indigenous peoples that predispose them to the cluster of charges noted above. To the contrary, I suggest that insofar as indigenous cultural claims always involve demand for more equitable distribution of land, political power, economic resources, the left materialist claim regarding the displacement of economic concerns by cultural ones is misplaced when applied to settler colonial contexts. Oh, shit. That was fucking fire. Damn. I gotta read that again. To the contrary, I suggest that insofar as indigenous cultural claims always involve demands for more equitable distribution of land, political power, and economic resources, the left materialist claim regarding the displacement of economic concerns by cultural ones is misplaced when applied to settler colonial contexts. Oh, because you know what matters more than words? Deeds! And First Nations people are already fighting for that thing. You see that? You're starting to see why I say that it's up to settlers, communists to get behind the leadership of First Nations? This is why. This is why I say that. Because materially, those and black people are the ones who are fighting towards that goal already. Materially. Practically. they were already fighting towards that goal. You don't think the theory is going to emerge among them? They don't need to read Marx for them to develop appropriate theory for their struggle. As, again, Juche teaches us, right? They just need to integrate theory with practice. The fact that Marxism is useful for that is all well and good, but let's not ignore that reality, right? Oh god, now what did I do? I fucking went all the way to the bottom somehow. Okay, back up to the top. Jesus Christ. Always once per stream I gotta do that, huh, chat? That's there. Okay, I was right here, yeah. Once per stream I have to make that mistake. Pro streamer right here. However, if one takes a modified version of the displacement theses and instead examines the relationship between indigenous recognition claims and the distinction made by Nancy Fraser between transformative and affirmative forms of redistribution, the criticism begins to hold more weight. For Fraser, transformative models of redistribution are those that aspire to correct unjust distributions of power and resources at their source, whereas affirmative strategies, by contrast, strive to alter or modify the second order effects of these first order root causes. As we shall see with the example drawn from my community, the last 40 years has witnessed a gradual erosion of this transformative vision within the mainstream Dene self-determination movement, which, in the context of Northern land claims, economic development has resulted in a partial decoupling of indigenous cultural claims from radical aspirations for social, political, and economic change that once underpinned them. However, following my reading of Fanon, I argue that this gradual displacement of questions of indigenous sovereignty and alternative political economies by narrowly conceived cultural claims within the Dene struggle is better understood as an effect of primitive accumulation via the hegemonization of the liberal discourse of recognition than due to some core deficiency with indigenous cultural politics as such. And the essentialism challenge. The second constellation of criticism, frequently leveled against the recognition paradigm, revolves around the essentialist articulations of individual and collective identity that sometimes anchor demands for cultural accommodation in theory and practice. In recent feminist, queer, and anti-racist literature, the term essentialism is often used pejoratively to refer to those theories and social practices that treat identity categories, such as gender, race, and class, as fixed, immutable, and universal, instead of being constructed, contingent, and open to cultural variation. According to Anne Phillips, when recognition-based models of cultural pluralism invoke essentialist articulations of identity, they risk functioning, quote, not as cultural liberator, but as cultural straitjacket, unquote. Forcing members of minority cultural groups into a regime of authenticity, denying them the chance to cross cultural borders, borrow cultural influences, define and redefine themselves. In order to avoid this potentially repressive feature of identity politics, we are told that the various expressions of identification and signification that underpin demand for recognition, such as gender, culture, nationhood, and tradition, must remain open-ended and never immune from constantation or democratic deliberation. The anti-essentialist position thus poses yet another set of challenges to the affirmative relationship drawn between recognition and freedom by uncritical supporters of the politics of difference. Chapter 3 unpacks some of the problems identified by the anti-essentialist challenge through a gendered analysis of the decade of Indigenous mega-constitutional politics, spanning the partition of Canada's Constitution Act, 1982, and the demise of the Charlottetown Accord in 1992. The Charlottetown Accord was a proposed agreement struck between the federal government, provincial and territorial governments, and Aboriginal representatives on a proposed series of amendments to the Constitution Act, 1982. Among other things, the amendments sought to address issues concerning the recognition of Quebec's distinct status within Confederation, and the recognition of an Aboriginal right to self-government and parliamentary reform. Although I remain indebted to the critical insights offered by Frantz Fanon and activists within the Dene Nation regarding the entangled relationship among racism, state power, capitalism, and colonial dispossession, all paid insufficient attention to the role played by the patriarchy in this corrosive configuration of power. Recent feminist analysis of the 10-year effort to constitutionally entrench the Aboriginal right to self-government provide a particularly illustrative corrective to this shortcoming. The cat is gone goblin mode. Specifically, these analyses have done an excellent job for grounding the manner in which contemporary essentialist articulations of Indigenous culture have convened with the legacy of patriarchal misrecognition under the Indian Act to discursively inform our recent efforts to attain recognition of a right to self-government. A good question, Plans fan, and I wonder that myself. I wonder if he has. My main question would be like, I wonder if he has a more favorable view towards existing socialist states. That would be my main question. Has that been altered? Like, not that. I mean, when we get right down to it, yes, there's lessons we can learn from those other states, etc. But not that that knowledge is necessarily required, right? Yeah, I wish you did call for full decolonization. However, even though I find much of this anti-essentialist inspired analysis compelling, I nonetheless hope to illuminate two problems that arise when this form of criticism is uncritically wielded in the context of Indigenous people's struggle for recognition, self-determination. First, using recent feminist and deliberative democratic critiques of Indigenous recognition politics as a backdrop, I demonstrate how normative appropriations of social constructivism can undercut the liberatory aspirations of anti-essentialist criticism by failing to adequately address the complexity of interlocking social relations that serve to exacerbate the types of exclusionary cultural practices that critics of essentialism find so disconcerting. Second, and perhaps more problematically, I show that when constructivist views of culture are posted and as a universal feature of social life, and then used as a means to evaluate the legitimacy of Indigenous claims for cultural recognition against the uncontested authority of the colonial state, it can serve to sanction the very forms of domination and inequality that anti-essentialist criticism ought to be mitigated. Chapter 4 examines the convergence of Indigenous recognition politics with the more recent transitional justice discourse of reconciliation, quote unquote, that began to gain considerable attention in Canada following the publication of the Report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People in 1996. RCAP was established by the federal government in 1991 in the wake of two national crises that unraveled the previous summer and fall, the failed Meech Lake Accord, and the armed standoff between Mohawks and Kanatski, Quebec, and the Canadian military, properly known as the Oka Crisis. The commission was established with a 16-point mandate to investigate the troubled relationship between Aboriginal people and the state, and to issue a series of comprehensive recommendations that might serve to facilitate the process of genuine quote-unquote reconciliation. The last 30 years have witnessed global proliferation of state institutional mechanisms that promote forgiveness and reconciliation as a means of resolving the adverse social impacts of various forms of intrastate violence and historical injustice. Originally, however, this approach to conflict resolution was developed in polities undergoing a formal transition from the violent history of open authoritarian regimes to a more democratic form of rule. This chapter will explore the efficacy of transitional justice mechanisms, such as state apologies, commissions of inquiry, truth and reconciliation commissions, individual reparations, and so forth, when applied to the non-transitional context of the Canadian settler state. In doing so, I argue that in settler colonial contexts such as Canada, where there is no formal period marking an explicit transition from an authoritarian past to a democratic present, state-sanctioned approaches to reconciliation tend to ideologically fabricate such a transition by narrowly situating the abuses of settler colonialism firmly in the past. In these situations, reconciliation itself becomes temporarily framed as the process of individually and collectively overcoming the harmful quote-unquote legacy left in the wake of the past abuse, while leaving the present structure of colonial rule largely unscathed. In such a context, those who refuse to forgive or reconcile are typically represented in the policy literature as suffering from this legacy, unable or unwilling to move on, quote unquote, because of their simmering anger and resentment. Drawing again on Frantz Fanon's work, I challenge the ways in which the Canadian reconciliation politics tends to uncritically represent Indigenous expressions of anger and resentment as negative emotion that threaten to impede the realization of reconciliation in the lives of Indigenous people and communities on the one hand, and between Indigenous nations and Canada on the other. Although it is on occasion acknowledged that reactive emotions like anger and resentment can generate both positive and negative effects, more often than not, defenders of reconciliation represent these emotional expressions in an asympathetic light, as irrational, as physically and psychologically unhealthy, as reactionary, backwards looking, and even as socially pathological. In contradiction to this view, I argue that in the context of ongoing settler colonial injustice, Indigenous people's anger and resentment can indicate a sign of moral protest, political outrage that we ought to at least take seriously, if not embrace, as a sign of our critical consciousness. By the end of Chapter 4, it should be evident why Fanon did not attribute much emancipatory potential to either Hegelian or liberal politics of recognition when applied to colonial situations. This did not lead Fanon to reject the recognition paradigm entirely, however. Instead, what Fanon's work does is redirect our attention to the host of self-affirmative cultural practices that colonized people often critically engage in to empower themselves, as opposed to relying too heavily on subjugation apparatus of the state or other dominant institutions of power to do this for them. In doing so, Fanon's position challenges colonized people to transcend the fantasy that the settler state apparatus as a structure of domination predicated on our ongoing dispossession is somehow capable of producing liberatory effects. The task of Chapter 5 is to flesh out this self-affirmative thread of Fanon's thought and politics through a critical reading of his engagement with the work of John Paul Sartre on the one hand and the negritude attitude on the other. Although constitutes a body of diverse inter- and post-war francophone black artistic production and political activism, at its core, the movement emphasized the need for colonized people and communities to purge themselves of the internalized effects of colonial racism through an affirmation of worth of black divergence. I argue that even though Fanon's critical appraisal clearly saw the revaluation of pre-colonial African cultural forms as a crucial means of momentarily freeing the colonized form of interpellative grasp of racist misrecognition, in the end, it will be shown that he shares Sartre's unwillingness to acknowledge the transformative role that critically revived indigenous cultures play. So he's saying Fanon shares Sartre's unwillingness to acknowledge the transformative role that critically revived indigenous cultural practices might play in the construction of alternatives to the colonial projects of genocide and land dispossession. That's interesting. I like that. I thus conclude the chapter with the claim that, although insightful in many respects, Fanon's overlies instrumental view of the relationship between culture and decolonization renders his theory inadequate as a framework for understanding contemporary indigenous struggles for self-determination. Indigenous peoples tend to view their resurgent practices for cultural self-recognition and empowerment as permanent features of our decolonial political projects, not transitional ones. The conclusion begins with the reiteration of the main line of argument defended in Red Skin, White Mass. That the liberal recognition-based approach to Indigenous self-determination in Canada that began to consolidate itself after the demise of the 1969 White Paper has not only failed, but now serves to reproduce the very forms of colonial power which original demands for recognition sought to transcend. This argument will undoubtedly be controversial to many Indigenous scholars and Aboriginal organization leaders, insofar as it suggests that much of our efforts over the last 4 decades to attain settler state recognition of our rights to land, self-government have in fact encouraged the opposite. The continued dispossession of our homelands and the ongoing usurpation of our self-determining authority. I suggest that this conclusion demands that we begin to collectively redirect our struggles away from a politics that seeks to attain a conciliatory form of settler state recognition for Indigenous nations towards a resurgent politics of recognition premised on self-actualization, direct action, and the resurgence of cultural practices that are attentive to the subjective and structural composition of settler colonial power. I thus conclude my investigation in Red Skin, White Mass with 5 theses on Indigenous politics that highlight core features of this resurgent approach to Indigenous decolonization in light of the Idle No More movement that exploded onto the Canadian political scene in Canada in late fall, early winter of 2012. What originally began in the fall of 2012 as an education campaign designed to inform Canadians about particular repugnant and undemocratic piece of legislation recently passed by Canadian federal government, the Jobs and Growth Act, or Bill C-45, which threatens to erode Indigenous land and treaty rights, as well as environmental protections for much of our waterways, had erupted by mid-January 2013 to a full-blown defense of indigenous land and sovereignty. Idle No More offers a productive case study through which to explore what a resurgent indigenous politics might look like on the ground. There is our introduction. What do we think of that introduction, chat? Give me your thoughts. Sounds like this is going to be a pretty interesting work, does it not? Tend to think the best way to use Sartre is to ignore him. Yeah. And I mean, what's going to be good is we're going to be able to, talk about how these conclusions can be used to go further in our analyses as well, right? I think this is going to be an extremely good work to talk our way through on this channel. Definitely good stuff. Now, let me just see something here. Now, as you know, coming up soon on our channel, the next movie we're going to be watching
heavy machine gun, 105 HP, 60mm mortar.
Keep the rest on full.
This is our next movie. It could be as early as tomorrow night if enough people are hanging out when I stream tomorrow night. Yeah, that's Frank. That's why I like Kuthar too, because he had to also work his way through the establishment curriculum and overcome those influences, right? Yeah, I think it's going to be a very useful work for us to talk about a lot on here.
那是我们的边界，祖国的方向。新中国万岁！新中国万岁！新中国万岁！新中国万岁！
You'll want to make sure you're here for that. Want to miss that, chat. And then, also, if you're ever looking for any upcoming reads we have coming, you can, of course, do the old theory list command in chat. Come up to this lovely work I got here. Now, what I have actually been thinking, though, is that maybe our next one, after we're done Red Skin, White Mask, will be given priority to ideological work is essential for accomplishing socialism. Because I think this will sort of complement a lot of what Comrade Glenshon Kuthal here is going to highlight. And it will show us like some of the more prescriptive things. And help us, it'll go further into detail about, overcoming the economic reductiveness that some Marxists fall into, etc. Also, chat, don't forget we got that challenge going on for me to do getting over it. So we're like just over 50% of the way through. You get me to 100,000 labor vouchers by the end of the month, and you make me play this for 2 hours.
Something you would have liked. A game that was empowering, that would save your progress and
you want to see me be tortured?
Since success is delicious, that would have been wise. Instead, I must confess, this isn't nice. It tastes of bitterness. It's capricious. It sets setbacks for the ambitious. It lacks lenience. It's bracing and inhumane. But not everyone's the same. I created this game for a certain kind of person. To hurt them.
Now, also for movies, I just want to point out, I found this nice DPRK video archive, and we have a whole bunch of movies here we can watch. I do have another newer one. I have to find it again, but it's called Comrade Kim Goes Flying. See if I can find the trailer for that. So we could, this is another movie that we could watch on here. Check out this one. What do you think?
엄마, 비둘기는 어떻게 하늘을 나나?
그건 날개가 있기 때문이란다.
나도 날개가 있으면 하늘을 날 수 있나?
그럼.
뛰어내리라!
떠서 다니지 말고 땅에 발붙이고 살아라. 노동자 술 직전에 출연시킵시다.
아닙니다. 잠깐만.
너는 땅속에서나 하늘을 날아보겠다고?
누워서 침대 들면 제 얼굴에 떨어진다는 걸 알아요.
부처녀가 자꾸만 눈앞에 울거리는 게 깨라는 거 말이에요.
물찬 재미가 거든.
What do you think? Look like a good one for the channel or what? Yeah, it seems like it'd be a pretty badass fucking movie for the channel. What? Yeah, adorable, right? Lighthearted, funny. I think that'd be a perfect pick to watch on here. The whole message of the movie is right here in this final like little scene there. Whoever you are, wherever you are, anything is possible. That is basically the message of the entire movie. I think it'd be cool to check that out. Want to leave us, one last thing, I want to leave us with a song here. Yeah, how dystopian, right, Frank? Anything? Anybody? Jeez. I don't know, it sounds pretty authoritarian. Okay, last thing. Let's end this on a nice musical note.
익숙하게 보란 듯이
That's a nice one. Oh, nice. Another contribution to the Getting Over It challenge. We're getting there. 56% of the way there. And we still got like 20 days left. I think I'm going to be playing it. Fantastic. Fantastic. Comrades help comrades. That's what we do. That's right. All right. Well, I'm glad you joined me, comrades. We're going to raid out to Subversive History now. Remember to come back on Tuesday. I will be streaming in the morning, and we're going to be continuing on with our read of Redskin White Mask, starting with Chapter 1 when we come back. So let's start a raid of Subversive History. And while we sign off, I want to leave you all with this quote today. The people are an almighty being, and one should pluck a star from the sky and bring a flower into bloom even on a rock if that is what they want. That's the quote I'm going to leave you all with today. Thank you, comrade. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for the support today. The subscription, again, greatly appreciated right now. Going through a rough time financially. And other than that, I appreciate all you comrades coming in and learning about Glenn Couthard with me. Nobody, who you are or where you are, anything is possible. And yeah, come join me again Monday, Tuesday mornings, Wednesday afternoon, and we're going to do Thursday around this time. We're going to see how that all works out. Thank you all for joining me. I love spending time with all you comrades. Please come back tomorrow night. I'll be doing a late stream tomorrow night. Come join me. Look at my schedule. Bye, everybody. Red salute.
Middle of the film where the guy gets like knocked unconscious and
Thanks, Larry.
What's up, Larry? What's up, Raiders?
but yeah, I would say Gallipoli, the older All Quiet on the Western Front, Das Boot, I think, is like a German submarine movie.
I've heard of that one, actually.
World War One, about World War One.